We all love to travel, to experience new cultures, see amazing sights, maybe even eat some questionable food from a street vendor, am I right? But the world can be a complicated place. Sometimes countries decide who they will and will not allow across their borders. This can come in the form of sanctions, advisories, or outright bans. Today, we're diving into travel restrictions. Specifically, the top 10 countries with restrictions for Canadian citizens. So, buckle up and let's navigate the world of international travel. Welcome to our channel, let's get started. Alright, kicking off our list at number 1, and probably not a huge surprise to anyone, is North Korea. Remember a few videos back when we talked about the importance of understanding history and context? Well, this is a prime example. Canada, along with many other UN nations, has imposed sanctions on North Korea due to its nuclear weapons program. This isn't just about paperwork, this is about taking a stand on a global issue. As a result, Canadians are straight up banned from traveling to North Korea. It's not a don't ask, don't tell situation, it's a hard no from the North Korean government. And honestly, even if you could go, would you want to? Think about it. Limited access to information, strict social rules. I mean, it's not exactly a recipe for a relaxing vacation. This isn't to say that North Korea isn't fascinating, it absolutely is. But it's a place with a lot of complex issues, and until those are resolved, it remains off limits to Canadians. Next up, at number 2, we have Syria. Now, Syria isn't an outright travel ban for Canadians, but it's about as close as you can get without being officially banned. The Canadian government strongly advises against all travel to Syria, and for good reason. The country has been ravaged by civil war for over a decade, and the situation remains incredibly volatile. We're talking widespread violence, terrorism, the risk of getting caught in the crossfire. It's just not a safe place for travelers right now. And this isn't about sheltering yourselves from the world's problems. It's about acknowledging that sometimes, the most responsible thing to do is to stay away. It's heartbreaking to see the devastation in Syria, and it's important to stay informed about what's happening there. But for now, the best way to help is to support humanitarian efforts from afar, and hope for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. Coming in at number 3 is Yemen, another country grappling with a complex and dangerous situation. Like Syria, Canada advises against all travel to Yemen, and again, the reasons are numerous and serious. Yemen has been embroiled in a civil war since 2014, and the conflict has led to a dire humanitarian crisis. But it's not just the fighting that's a concern, it's the presence of terrorist groups, the risk of kidnapping, even piracy off the coast. It's a lot, and it all adds up to a travel destination that's just not worth the risk for Canadians right now. It's one thing to push your comfort zone when you travel, it's another thing entirely to put yourself in harm's way. Yemen, like Syria, deserves our attention and our empathy, but for now, it's best to stay informed from a distance and support organizations working to help the Yemeni people. Number 4 on our list brings us to Libya, a nation struggling to find its footing after years of turmoil. Canada, you guessed it, advises against all travel to Libya. Since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, Libya has been plagued by instability and violence. Rival factions, militias, and terrorist groups all vie for control, creating a chaotic and dangerous environment. Kidnapping is a serious concern in Libya, particularly for foreigners. And if that wasn't enough, the country lacks a functioning central government, which means essential services are unreliable at best. It's a recipe for disaster, and it's just not a risk worth taking, no matter how adventurous you might be. Libya has so much potential, but until it achieves some semblance of peace and stability, it's best to admire it from afar. Our 5th country on the list is Somalia, a nation that has faced more than its fair share of challenges. And you guessed it again, Canada advises against all travel to Somalia. For decades, Somalia has been plagued by civil war, famine, and terrorism. The Al-Shabaab militant group, affiliated with Al-Qaeda, poses a significant threat, carrying out attacks throughout the country. The risk of kidnapping in Somalia is extremely high, especially for foreigners. And the country's healthcare system is practically non-existent in many areas, making even minor injuries a potentially life-threatening situation. It's a lot to process, I know, but it's important to be aware of these realities. Somalia is a country with a rich history and culture, but it's a place where even the most experienced travelers should tread very, very carefully. At number 6 we have South Sudan, a young nation still grappling with the legacy of conflict. Canada, as you might expect, advises against all travel to South Sudan. Since gaining independence from Sudan in 2011, South Sudan has been embroiled in a brutal civil war. The conflict has resulted in widespread human rights abuses, famine, and a massive refugee crisis. Armed groups operate with impunity in many areas, and the risk of getting caught in the crossfire is very real. The lack of infrastructure and basic services adds another layer of complexity, making travel in South Sudan incredibly difficult and dangerous. It's a heartbreaking situation, and it's a reminder that peace is a fragile thing. South Sudan needs our support, but it's the kind of support best given from afar, through humanitarian aid and advocacy. In at number 7 is the Central African Republic, a country facing a complex humanitarian and security crisis. You know the drill. Canada advises against all travel to the Central African Republic. The country has been plagued by violence and instability for years, with various armed groups vying for control. The conflict has resulted in widespread human rights abuses, displacement, and a dire need for humanitarian assistance. The lack of a strong central government and the presence of armed groups make travel incredibly dangerous. Kidnapping, armed robbery, and carjacking are all serious concerns, and the security situation can change rapidly. It's a lot to take in, and it's a reminder that the world can be a very complicated place. The Central African Republic needs our attention and support, but for now, the safest course of action is to stay informed and contribute to humanitarian efforts from afar. Shifting gears a bit, at number 8, we have Iran. Now, unlike the previous entries, Canada doesn't have a blanket travel advisory against Iran. However, they do advise against all non-essential travel to the country. The situation in Iran is complex. While it's not a war zone like some of the other countries on our list, there are still significant risks to be aware of. The Iranian government has a history of arbitrarily detaining foreigners, including Canadians. Dual nationals are particularly vulnerable, and there have been cases of Canadians being held on dubious charges. The legal system in Iran is opaque, and consular services can be limited, which is a really gentle way of saying it can be very difficult to get help if you get into trouble. So, while Iran has a rich history, stunning architecture, and a vibrant culture, it's essential to weigh the risks carefully before planning a trip. Number 9 on our list brings us to Russia. Now, before you grab your Ushankas and book a one-way ticket to Moscow, it's important to understand the nuances of the travel advisory here. Canada advises against all travel to certain regions of Russia, specifically the North Caucasus region, including Chechnya and Dagestan. These areas have experienced ongoing violence and instability for years, and the security situation remains volatile. The risk of terrorism is also a concern in these regions, and there have been attacks targeting civilians. So, while much of Russia is generally safe for travel, it's crucial to steer clear of these specific areas. It's like that old saying, Russia is a riddle, wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. But seriously, do your research, be aware of the regional differences, and stay safe. And finally, rounding out our list at number 10, we have Belarus. Canada advises against all non-essential travel to Belarus, and there are a few reasons for this. In recent years, Belarus has seen a crackdown on dissent and human rights. The government has been criticized for its authoritarian practices, and there have been protests met with harsh responses. The situation at the border with Ukraine adds another layer of complexity. Given the ongoing conflict, tensions are high, and the border region is best avoided. So, while Belarus has its share of historical sites and natural beauty, it's essential to be aware of the political climate and potential risks before planning a trip. So, there you have it, the top 10 countries with travel restrictions or advisories for Canadians. It's a lot to process, I know. The world is full of amazing places to explore. It's important to be informed and make responsible decisions. Traveling to a country with a travel advisory means being extra vigilant and prepared. Do your research. Check the government website and read travel advisories. Talk to people who have been there. Knowledge is power and can mean the difference between a safe trip and a dangerous situation. Travel restrictions can change frequently, so always check the official government website. Ensure you have the necessary visas and documentation. Register with the Canadian government's Registration of Canadians Abroad Service. Stay safe and travel smart.